On the plain of Ain Jalut in 1260, the fate of the Islamic world narrowed into one violent decision. The Mongols were coming, not as rumor, not as a distant terror from the edges of Asia. They were already there, already inside Syria, already carrying with them the memory of cities burned, dynasties erased, caliphs humiliated, and entire populations reduced to warnings for the next target. Men did not need to imagine what defeat looked like. They had seen it in Baghdad. They had seen it in the broken spine of the old Eastern Islamic world. So when the Mamluk army waited in the valley and watched the dust of the enemy rise in the distance, this was not just another battle between rival powers. It was a test of whether there would still be an Islamic world left to defend. And standing near the center of that moment was a man who should never have been there if the ordinary laws of rank and birth had held. A slave, a foreigner, a child once torn from the northern steppe, sold in a market trained to obedience, hardened into war, and then transformed by sheer force of intelligence, cruelty, and command into one of the most formidable rulers of the medieval age. His name was Baibars, and what he understood before many men born above him ever could was that the Mongols were not invincible. They were only terrifying. Those are not the same thing. One is a fact about force. The other is a psychological empire. Baibars knew that if the second could be broken, the first might be made to bleed. To understand why Baibars mattered so much, we have to begin far from Egypt, far from Syria, far from the polished language of sultans and courts in the grasslands north of the Black Sea, in the world now associated broadly with Ukraine, where he was born around 1223 among the Kipchak Turks. That beginning is important because it shaped him long before command ever did. The steppe teaches movement violence and uncertainty before it teaches anything else. A child there learns quickly that safety is temporary, that horseflesh is power, and that strength means little if another stronger man arrives tomorrow. Baibars did not remain in that world long. He was captured young in a raid and sold into the slave trade that fed the military markets of the Islamic Middle East. That is where the first great irony of his life appears. What should have been a story of reduction became the beginning of ascent, because the system that consumed him was the Mamluk system. And the Mamluks were not ordinary slaves. They were purchased, converted, drilled, educated, and remade into elite military property. Foreign boys stripped of their old loyalties so they could become instruments of a new political order. This distinction matters enormously. Baibars was enslaved, yes, but he was enslaved into one of the hardest and most efficient martial schools in the medieval world. In Egypt, Mamluk training was not merely physical conditioning, it was total reconstruction. Young recruits were taught horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, formation, discipline, command, etiquette, languages, court culture, and the ruthless habits of men expected to survive in both war and palace intrigue. The transcript is right to emphasize the brutality of this education, because that brutality is one of the keys to Baibars himself. He was not molded in comfort, he was sharpened. He learned early that survival required more than courage. It required observation. It required reading other men before they fully declared themselves. It required seeing institutions as battlefields. And from the beginning, he stood out. He mastered mounted combat. He proved terrifyingly capable with bow and blade. He showed the kind of instinctive battlefield awareness that cannot be reduced to training alone. Some men become good soldiers because they obey. Baibars became dangerous because he understood. The scar on his face, mentioned in the transcript, belongs in the story for that reason. Later sources suggest it made him look less desirable as merchandise when he was still moving through the market world of enslavement. Some buyers reportedly saw it as a bad sign. That detail matters not because the scar made him mystical, but because it captures the pattern of his entire life. Men looked at Baibars repeatedly and misjudged what they were seeing. A scarred boy, a slave, a Mamluk officer among many others. A commander, yes, but not yet the center. An ambitious subordinate under stronger names. Again and again, he emerged from categories meant to contain him. The wound on his face becomes, in retrospect, almost symbolic of the larger truth. The world kept trying to assign him a limit, and he kept turning the limit into a weapon. By the time Baibars reached maturity, the Ayyubid political order founded by Saladin was already weakening, and the Mamluks were becoming more than military servants. They were the pillars holding the state together. This is crucial. He rose not in a settled and secure realm, but in a transitional system where armies mattered as much as dynastic legitimacy. That meant battlefield talent could become political capital fast if the owner of that talent knew how to survive intrigue. Baibars did. He distinguished himself in campaigns against the Crusaders, and this experience matters because it formed one half of his later greatness. The Crusader states were not collapsing ornaments. They still held hard coastal fortresses, strategic depth, and a stubborn military culture of their own. Fighting them taught Baibars the value of fortification pressure, attritional logic, and the need to combine force with method. He learned that brute courage alone is wasteful if not aimed correctly. He also learned that prestige enemies must be broken visibly. Castles mattered not only because they controlled land. They mattered because they embodied the confidence of those who held them. Baibars would remember that lesson for the rest of his life. At the same time, he learned the other half of power in the Mamluk world politics as controlled violence. The court was no less dangerous than the battlefield. Rivalry, patronage, faction, grievance, and sudden murder shaped advancement just as surely as cavalry charges. A man who fought well but failed to read ambition died quickly or remained useful to smarter men forever. Baibars was not born to remain useful. He watched the flow of influence as carefully as he watched the movements of enemy cavalry. He learned which men could be served, which could be used, and which would have to be removed eventually. That is why he cannot be understood as a simple hero in the old moral sense. He was too hard for that, too political, too intelligent about the uses of fear. Like many truly great rulers, he was already becoming dangerous off the battlefield before history made him indispensable on it. Then the Mongols forced the entire Islamic world to clarify what kind of age it was living in. No account of Baibars can make sense without the full scale of that shock. The Mongol Empire had already become the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from East Asia to the edges of Europe. And it did not expand like ordinary states. It moved with a combination of speed, terror, and adaptive military intelligence that made resistance look futile in one region after another. The transcript points to Samarkand and Baghdad in particular is essential because its fall in 1258 shattered more than a city. It shattered psychological order. The Abbasid Caliphate, whatever its real political weakness by that time, still carried symbolic gravity as the old center of Islamic prestige. When Hulagu Khan took Baghdad, looted it, massacred its people, and left the Tigris darkened by ink from manuscripts thrown into the water, the message was not subtle. Nothing sacred remained beyond Mongol reach. Libraries, palaces, mosques, and dynasties could all be broken. The Islamic world had already known internal division, crusader pressure, and political decay. Now it was confronted by something worse, an enemy that seemed to make those old crises look provincial. This is the atmosphere into which Egypt under the Mamluks stepped as the last serious center of resistance. That point cannot be overemphasized. By the late 1250s, with Baghdad ruined and Damascus taken, Egypt was no longer merely another important Muslim power. It was the final great state standing between the Mongol armies and full domination of the Arab Middle East. If Egypt fell, the political and spiritual consequences would have been immeasurable. The Mamluks understood that, and Baibars more than most understood the shape of the threat. The Mongols were terrifying not only because of their brutality, though that brutality mattered. They were terrifying because they combined it with system. Fast cavalry, deep reconnaissance, psychological warfare, siege engineers, operational coordination. They did not merely smash armies. They arranged conditions under which armies fell apart before the decisive blow even landed. Baibars saw clearly that to face such an enemy in ordinary open battle on their preferred terms would be suicide. The Mamluks needed something more than courage. They needed design. At this stage, the nominal head of the Mamluk state was Sultan Qutuz, and Baibars served as his most formidable field commander. Their relationship is one of the central tensions of the story and should never be simplified. Qutuz was not a fool, and Baibars was not merely his loyal instrument. Both men understood the scale of the moment. Both also understood ambition. Victory against the Mongols would create immense prestige. Prestige in a military slave state is politically unstable power. So as the crisis deepened, their temporary cooperation was bound tightly by necessity and only thin by trust. Still, necessity held, and necessity was enough to bring them to the field. The Mongol force left behind in Syria under Kitbuka remained lethal even after Hulagu withdrew eastward to deal with succession matters following the death of the Great Khan. This is another vital point. Ain Jalut was not some accidental fight against a weak residue. It was a clash with a highly capable Mongol field army led by a seasoned commander and sustained by the reputation of total victory in campaign after campaign. Many rulers would have delayed, negotiated, or tried only to preserve Egypt defensively. The Mamluks chose battle. That decision was extraordinary because at the time, it still looked very much like stepping voluntarily in front of the storm that had destroyed everyone else. Baibars made that decision survivable by controlling the terrain. The transcript stresses the valley, and its narrowing, semi-mountainous character, and that is exactly where the story should linger. The Mongols lived in maneuver. They wanted room for mounted archery room, for feigned retreat room, for envelopment room, for psychological compression through movement. Baibars chose Ain Jalut precisely because it denied them that language. He could not out-Mongol the Mongols on open ground, so he edited the battlefield. He selected a zone where cavalry breadth would be reduced, where concealment was possible, where reserve forces could remain hidden, and where the enemy's confidence in its own methods might become a trap. This is what great commanders do. They do not simply seek good ground. They seek ground that makes the enemy misread his own strength. He also prepared his men mentally, and that matters every bit as much as the physical arrangement. The Mongols had already conquered by reputation in many places. Their name worked like an advance unit. Soldiers broke because they believed breaking was what happened to those who faced them. Baibars needed to undo that before the battle began. So he reminded the Mamluks of what lay behind them. Egypt, the last great Muslim power. Cairo, the refuge of a civilization already in retreat. The certainty that there would be no second line if they failed. Fear had to be converted into obligation. A Mamluk army composed of highly trained cavalry and disciplined military slaves already possessed superior cohesion to many other regional forces. Baibars' gift was to connect that cohesion to a narrative of final necessity. The battle would not just test the army. It would prove whether destiny itself could still be challenged.
This is our moment. Seize it with all!
His plan followed the logic of the best step warfare and then inverted it. He placed part of his army in concealment, likely in woods or broken ground near the battlefield. Then he advanced his visible line, engaged, and began to yield. This is the key moment. The Mamluks appeared to break under Mongol pressure. For Kitbuka and his officers, this looked familiar. Another enemy line bending, another final opportunity to drive pursuit hard and finish the field. That familiarity is what made the trap possible. The most effective military deceptions are not the ones the enemy has never seen. They are the ones that look exactly like what he most expects to see. The Mongols followed. Their confidence did half the work for Baibars. Then the concealed Mamluk forces came out. The valley narrowed the fight. The Mongols, so often the encirclers, found themselves pressed from multiple directions. The battle became a hard, close, ferocious clash rather than the broad, mobile annihilation they preferred to create. The transcript gives Baibars a highly visible personal role here, and whether every detail of his exact movements can be reconstructed, the underlying truth should remain. He fought at the front or close enough to it for his men to feel him as a physical presence in the crisis. This mattered immensely in Mamluk military culture. Elite slave soldiers were bound to one another and to command through a system where visible courage from above carried enormous force. Baibars did not merely tell men to stand. He embodied the fact that retreat was no longer an available language. Kitbuka, to his credit, did not collapse when the trap revealed itself. He fought hard, and according to tradition, refused withdrawal even when the position had become desperate. That belongs in the story because Ain Jalut matters more when the enemy is seen clearly. The Mongols were not defeated there because they were careless fools. They were defeated because, for one of the first times, a regional opponent of sufficient discipline and intelligence had forced them into a battle that corrupted their own methods and then refused to fear the reputation those methods carried. Kitbuka's death or capture and execution, depending on the precise rendering, became the emotional hinge of the fight. Once the commander at the center of the Mongol force fell, coherence began to rot. The retreat that followed was no staged withdrawal. It was breakdown. The importance of that moment can hardly be overstated. For the first time in the eyes of much of the Islamic world, and arguably in a larger interregional sense as well, the Mongols had been beaten decisively in a major battle by a Muslim army that had not simply survived, but reversed the expected logic of fear. Egypt was saved. Syria was no longer just lost ground. The myth of total Mongol invincibility took its first truly public fracture, and Baibars emerged from the field no longer merely as a gifted commander, but as the man through whom history had changed direction. Yet victory did not create peace. It created a power vacuum within the Mamluk state itself, because Qutuz returned from Ain Jalut as a hero too. And Baibars did not intend to remain second. This is where his story darkens and becomes unmistakably political in the harshest sense. Tensions between the two had already existed, fed by questions of recognition, patronage, and future power. Ain Jalut magnified them. Baibars knew what he had done. He knew what his role had been. He also knew how fast military glory can be stolen by the man already on the throne if decisive action is delayed. On the return from campaign, Qutuz was assassinated under circumstances that remained murky only in the way politically useful murders often do. The transcript is right not to pretend certainty where certainty does not exist. But the broader historical judgment remains powerful. Baibars almost certainly stood close enough to the conspiracy, and perhaps inside it, that Qutuz's death became the necessary violence of his ascent. This should not be washed clean. Great builders of states are often born in murder because unstable systems rarely transfer power without blood when ambition is strong enough. Baibars seized the throne and was proclaimed Sultan of Egypt and Syria. That was only the beginning. Many rulers can kill a rival. Fewer can convert murder into durable legitimacy. The Mamluk state was inherently unstable, a military aristocracy of former slaves fiercely competitive, often loyal only as long as reward and fear were distributed correctly. Baibars understood that with exceptional clarity. He moved fast to consolidate his base, reorganize command, and ensure that key positions were held by men bound to him. He rewarded allies. He watched rivals. He did not trust sentiment or old friendship to sustain anything. This is one of the reasons his reign lasted and mattered. He treated politics exactly as he had treated battle shape. The field, isolate the threats, leave as little to chance as possible. Then he did something even more intelligent. He understood symbols. With the Abbasid Caliphate shattered by the Mongols, the Islamic world had lost not only a political center, but a sacred continuity. Baibars brought a surviving Abbasid prince to Cairo and restored the caliphal title there under his protection. The caliph would hold little real power, But that was not the point. The point was legitimacy. Cairo would now stand not merely as a military capital, but as the protected center of Islamic continuity after Baghdad's destruction. This was a brilliant act of political theater with strategic consequences. It told the Muslim world that what the Mongols had tried to erase could still live, though now under Mamluk guard. It also elevated Baibars beyond the status of a successful warlord. He became the defender of Islam in symbolic as well as military terms, in a fractured age that mattered enormously. From there, he moved outward. Against the Crusaders, Baibars pursued a systematic logic rather than random opportunism. He retook or reduced fortress after fortress, including major positions long considered nearly untouchable. Most famously, Crac de Chevalier. This is important because it shows his consistency as a strategist. He did not confuse victory at Ain Jalut with a permanent end to danger. He knew Egypt and Syria would only truly stabilize if the two great external threat systems around them, the Mongols inland and the Crusaders on the coast, were both weakened in sequence. So he hit the Crusader states methodically, taking strong points, breaking lines of communication, and stripping the Latin presence of depth. Against the Mongols, he remained vigilant, confronting some forces directly, while navigating others through diplomacy when useful. He did not romanticize continuous combat. He balanced force and negotiation according to advantage, and that is one of the clearest signs of mature statecraft. Internally, his reforms were no less serious. He strengthened tax collection to stabilize revenue. He invested in infrastructure, fortresses, roads, irrigation, communications. He turned Cairo into a military, commercial, and intellectual center of the Islamic world. He improved messaging networks using fast couriers and carrier pigeons to make the Sultanate more responsive across space. He understood trade as a weapon of survival as much as war. Egypt sat between Mediterranean and Red Sea networks, and under Baibars that position was cultivated aggressively. Merchants from Europe, India, and farther east moved through a space he was deliberately strengthening. In all of this, the same principle appears again and again. Battle wins moments. Administration makes those moments matter after the field is cleared. And still, Baibars never stopped ruling through vigilance. The transcript is right to emphasize his surveillance networks, because they were central to the durability of his reign. He watched rivals, governors, commanders, and notables constantly. In a state where elite military men held real force and had every reason to dream of advancement, not watching meant dying. Baibars did not die that way. He preferred preemption. Severe punishments were part of this order, so were selective rewards. Like many effective rulers from hard military societies, he understood that loyalty must be fed and fear must be refreshed. Leave either unattended too long, and the whole structure begins plotting. By the time of his death in 1277, Baibars had done far more than win one famous battle. He had changed the strategic balance of the Middle East. He had helped halt the westward movement of Mongol power at one of its most critical fronts. He had degraded the Crusader states systematically. He had transformed the Mamluk Sultanate from a military elite regime into the dominant Muslim power of the region. He had recentered the Islamic world in Cairo after the destruction of Baghdad. And he had done all of this not as a prince bred to command from birth, but as a man sold in a slave market and remade through one of the harshest institutions of his age. That does not make him morally simple. It makes him historically immense. Baibars should not be remembered as a saint. He rose through violence, intrigue, and likely assassination. He ruled through fear when necessary, and sometimes when more than necessity alone demanded it. But none of that reduces the scale of what he achieved. He looked at an age collapsing under invasion, fragmentation, and fear, and forced it to change direction. He understood that survival required more than battlefield courage. It required institutions, symbols, infrastructure, intelligence, legitimacy, and above all, the willingness to act before events hardened into inevitability. That is why his life still matters, because his story is not merely that a slave became a king. It is that a man born into total vulnerability learned how power actually works, mastered it at every level, from cavalry charge to court ritual, and then used it to save a civilization that had already begun to believe it might not survive.
In this hall we forge the bonds of empire. By this investiture you are affirmed. I accept with honor.